Well, thank you very much for tracking me down on Twitter and inviting me to talk to you. I'm going to talk in a rather general way, and obviously I'm giving my own view because I know that you read a lot of historians, and I'm happy to debate my own view, in questions later on. And I'm going to start with a figure from the research. I know you've done a lot of reading on Cheshire, but I'm going to talk about Warwickshire a little bit. And I'm beginning with a figure from the first research I ever did on the Civil War in Warwickshire, and a pamphlet from February 1643, talking about the parliamentarian leader in the county who's raising troops to fight against the royalists in Warwickshire and Staffordshire. He's called Lord Brooke. And I just want to make three, I think, important points at the beginning. First, he's an aristocrat. He's a nobleman, and he's on the Parliament side. So that makes us think about social status and side-taking. Secondly, the pamphlet describing his activities is printed. It's a short pamphlet, it's relatively cheap, and it's printed in London for people around the country to know what's going on in Warwickshire. And thirdly, with the quotation that you can read for yourselves, he's insisting that the Parliament's cause is the Lord's cause, that we're fighting for true religion and our own and the kingdom's safety. They're a godly army, like the army of King David in the Old Testament. And Lord Brooke actually dies, he's killed in Lichfield, where I now live, within a couple of weeks of this. But he's in some ways quite like Oliver Cromwell. According to this pamphlet, he's raising troops and he's electing his officers. It says electing, which is an interesting phrase. The pamphlet says that mercenaries, soldiers who would fight for money, were present and offered their service to Brooke for his army. And he said no. And in a phrase that we're familiar with from him, he said, I don't want people who are fighting for money. I want people who are fighting for the cause, which is God's cause as well. So he has a view of side-taking as, very highly motivated by, particularly here, religion, though he also talks about laws and liberties, sort of political issues. Now, it's February 1643, so I think the other point to say is that side-taking isn't something that happens all at once. It's a process. The war, develops slowly. There had been a struggle for control of Warwickshire in the summer of 1642 between Lord Brooke for the Parliament and the Royalists. I'm going to talk more about parliamentarians, which you might think is a real bias in my work, but the Royalist leader is called the Earl of Northampton, but that's the only time I'll mention him probably. And the struggle in the summer of 1642 ended really with a stalemate. There were Royalist strongholds, but Parliament controlled the major areas of the county. It controlled Warwick Castle because Brooke owned Warwick Castle and had garrisoned it with his allies, with his servants, with his tenants. And it controlled Coventry because, as you might be familiar with from Hull, which is more famous for this than Coventry, in August 1642, the king came to Coventry and he wanted to get the arms of the county out of the city. The gates were shut in his face, and in the end his army had to withdraw because an army came from London. And commentators said that the morale in Coventry was strengthened from volunteers from elsewhere in the county, particularly from the factious, seditious town of Birmingham. And they were talking about artisans, small landowners, and so on. So in 1642, Brooke's success, relative success, came in a variety of ways. he seems to have got some more support from the social ranks below the gentry than the Royalists did, particularly from the northern industrial parts of the county. He was, on the other hand, he got very relatively little support from the landed elite, from the gentry, who were mostly Royalist. So we might have a complicated social explanation going on. But it's also important to say that also decisive was the army that came from London, an army raised in London. And in fact, Brooke's army that's raised, that fights in the Midlands in the early months of 1643, though it had been raised in, partly raised in Staffordshire and Warwickshire, a lot of its members came from London. One of its officers, for instance, was a man called John Lilburn, who you might have heard of, who later becomes a Leveller leader. So I think what happens in Warwickshire is an interesting introduction to all sorts of issues about side taking. And I do believe, and you may be thinking about long-term factors and short-term factors, there are a lot of very particular religious and political issues that are important in 1640 to 43 or whenever. But I think we need also to think about broader overall structural, if you like, changes that affected the choices that people had, and also the degree to which they were able to make a choice. Now, how much choice did people have? If you lived near a Royalist garrison and you're asked to pay taxes, are you taking sides if you obey them and you give them your horses or you give them their money to supply you? So there's a thing about them, you know, if you're a Royalist in Essex, you have to be a rather braver than if you're a Royalist in, I don't know, Denbighshire or Cornwall. So there's things about choice people have, if you like, in the military context. There's also about what choice do you have if you're Lord Brooke's steward, or if you rent land from him in Ulster, which is a place in Warwickshire. Now, I think you have to be careful with that sort of choice, because as I'll say, I think there's a lot of evidence that Lord Brooke chose his servants because they agreed with him. You know, he's very radical in his religious views, and he tended to choose his household officers because they shared his beliefs, broadly speaking. So that's an interesting thing about choice and independence. We shouldn't necessarily assume that people are just obeying their superiors. They might actually be agreeing with their superiors. So individual choices, I think, have to be understood within very more broader, complicated process. Well, they're not that complicated, actually, don't they? And I've put 4 issues I think are very important there. So I'm going to just state very briefly. Firstly, by 1640, there had been a very significant period of social and economic expansion in England. More agriculture, efficiency, more industry, more trade. The economy had expanded. What that meant were, I think, 2 very important things. The middling sort, which you've probably read about in some of your sources, the middling sort in the main had expanded and got more prosperous. I think there's a historian called Alexander Shepherd, who I think has proved that by looking at certain sorts of records. Rich people mostly also had done well. Poor people hadn't, because there was inflation and lots of incomes were fixed. So as the middling sort of expanded, and secondly, there's winners and losers. The poor are a big loser, but also some people hadn't. If your rents were fixed and you could sell your product in the marketplace, you're probably making a profit. If your rents go up and you have to buy your food, you're not doing so well. So there are winners and losers. And there are anxieties about obedience and social hierarchy, about how you gain people's assent to your social status, for instance, because there is a group who are increasingly prosperous, increasingly confident in many ways. And I think worth thinking about Brooke in that way. Brooke is a popular leader. He's rallying people to his side on the basis of religious and political principles as much as through economic and social power. And that you could see that as one tactic, how to be a nobleman in a society where people are necessarily obeying orders unquestionably. So social and economic change, it's not always fashionable, but can be connected, I think, to some of the issues about side changing. Political participation. Really want to emphasise this. Brooke says he was electing his officers. I'm not clear that that's absolutely true, but the notion that he's electing his officers is an interesting one. Men of small property, not the poor, but not the rich either, men of small property in England by 1640 were used to political participation in a broad sense. They weren't running for Parliament, but they were sitting on local juries. They were acting as constables and church wardens in their local communities, in their villages. They understood the law. They were confident in running affairs. And I think that's very important. Very significant proportion of men had some formal engagement with the structures of power in the church and in the state. And women, I've written about women more recently, women often had informal power in their communities, establishing moral norms and so on. So the notion of the law and government should be according to law is a very important one that people are well aware of. And whether the king was ruling according to law, whether Parliament was breaking the law by opposing him, is an important issue. Religious change is vitally important. Brooke saw himself and his army, walking in the steps of King David. And of course, what is incredibly important in England, and I'm talking mainly about England, though I'll mention Scotland and Ireland in a minute, is England has a partial and contested Reformation. It's a Protestant country, definitively, but it's a Protestant country where there's a significant Catholic minority, and some historians now think we've underestimated the significance of Catholics in politics. And it's a country where Protestants disagree about whether the Reformation is complete, whether it's gone far enough. Brooke is one of these people who thinks the Reformation hasn't gone far enough. Brooke actually, as I've said before, is someone who believes in religious liberty. He's on a radical wing, even among parliamentarians. But there's lots of divisions about religion in a society where religion is very important. And I don't want to cut off religion from politics, because people also thought the English law and the English political system was a barrier against popery, against Catholicism. But it's often religion and this notion that you're fighting a war for true religion that I think is very, very important to allegiance. The last thing I want to stress, which is connected in a way to all the others, and comes back to this: if you're in London or Cheshire or Essex or Wales, even where, you could have read a pamphlet telling you what's going on in Warwickshire or London. And I think there is a communications revolution by the middle of the 17th century, which I think is very significant. People are well informed, and they're increasingly well informed through reading printed propaganda, news books, literature. Now it's a bit like the communications revolution that I've lived through of the internet. People were more literate than their parents. In lots of families, the children could read and their parents, certainly their mother, would not have been able to. Most people can't read, but a very significant, large minority of people can. And everybody knows, has a neighbour, a brother who's had more schooling through good luck, who can read. And they know what's going on. Don't believe any of these books that tell you people didn't know what was going on. And as I'm going to say a little bit more later on, they're in the late 1630s, early 1640s. There's a whole explosion. People, I've been told off for saying explosion of print, but there are lots more small, cheap pamphlets, news books that people can find out what's going on. And I say it's something that is new. It's probably, along with the Dutch revolt of the 16th century, it's the first conflict, revolution, revolt that print is massively important for, in propagandizing people, in explaining what's going on, in inviting people to reflect on both sides. My argument about side taking is actually, I think that in lots of these issues, Parliament has a sort of advantage which counteracts its major disadvantage. The major disadvantage is that people are profoundly educated into being obedient to hierarchy and obedient to monarchy. So it's very hard to justify resistance of the king. And I think in many parts of the country, lots of these developments, informing people, getting to think about things, fighting the Lord's battles, being confident in your community, not wanting to be told what to do, believing in the rule of law and so on, fit in the parliamentarian rather than the royalist initiative. Now, Charles I does similar things eventually. He does use propaganda, he does use print, but it's rather slower and more reluctantly. So I'm just going to go now through some issues. I'm not going to talk particularly about Scotland and Ireland, except as they impact on England, because that's what I know about. But I want to make a couple of points. Of course, it's Scotland, revolt in Scotland, that enables, forces Charles to call a parliament and starts the whole thing off. And I want to make a point I've made already. People in England are well informed about what's going on in Scotland through print and discussion of print, as well as through word of mouth. And the Scottish revolt raises this whole issue. We're brought up to be obedient, but we're brought up to be obedient to God and the king. What do you do if you're not sure that the king is on God's side or God is on the king's side, whichever way around you want to think about it? You'll have done, I think, work, to a lot of zealous Puritans, people who thought there should be a further reformation. The king's religious policies, the 1620s and 30s, look like Catholicism. They look like a return to popery. He's not a Catholic. He dies for the Church of England in the end in some ways, but it looks to people like Catholic. And this is the issue in a deeply loyal society, in a revolt led by the nobility in Scotland, but we're obeying the law, we're obeying God. And the kings have made an oath to rule as God tells them. Now, I've said people are used to participating in the affairs of their local community. They're used to working together to run things. Parliament, from very early on, took advantage of this, or was able to chime in with that sort of political process. In May 1641, when the parliamentary opposition to Charles feared a military coup and were about to execute the Earl of Strafford, Charles's chief minister, they invited or instructed the population to take an oath called the protestation. They took it first in Parliament, they printed it, and in several parts of the country they organised all men to take it, and in many places women took it too. It was a fairly uncontroversial oath. It was an oath to defend the monarchy, the privileges of Parliament, the rule of law, and the Protestant religion. It's like motherhood and apple pie, if you like. No one disagrees with it. But it's inviting people collectively to vow to support those issues in a context where they're arguing that there are people who don't believe in the Protestant religion or the rule of law. And it's initiated by the House of Commons, not by the King and his government, not by the House of Lords. They're inviting people to join together and participate. In May 1641, June 1641, it's taken quite extensively in London. London's very important to the parliamentary cause, but also in some other parts of the country. Where it's taken very broadly is after the Irish Rebellion. Again, there's this printed propaganda around the Irish Rebellion which massively exaggerates the undoubted atrocities that did take place on both sides, but these are the atrocities Catholics impose on the Protestant settlers, roasting people alive and so on, probably may or may not have happened. So the Irish Rising is this terrible fear of a Catholic Irish Rising. It's propagandised round the country in pamphlets that people read and talk about. And then, very shortly after that, the protestation is taken in most of England, invited to join together to defend fundamental interests. And the Irish Rising is a very significant dissolution of loyalty to the king. The Irish rebels claim that they're not rebels, they're rising to defend Charles I from his Puritan enemies. They forge a commission that says Charles I invited them to rise. It's a forgery, but it's plausible. People are worried that Charles really did encourage the Catholic Irish to rebel in order to defend his position in England and Scotland. That's because various reasons, but particularly because of his religious policies, his foreign Catholic wife, his personality and so on. So after the Irish Rising, Parliament, House of Commons in particular, make great efforts to involve the people in defence of Protestantism, law, true religion, the king, but the king behaving himself. And they also issue something called a Grand Remonstrance. The Grand Remonstrance was by this time a controversial declaration of all the misdeeds of Charles's reign, culminating in the argument that there was a popish conspiracy, a Catholic conspiracy, in order to undermine the rule of law and the true Protestant religion. By this time, Parliament is much more divided than it had been a year before. It's been meeting for a year, carried out lots of reforms, and people start to think it's gone far enough. So it only passes by 11 votes in the Commons. What is even more controversial, though, is the decision to print the Grand Remonstrance and circulate it round the country. Parliament decides that it's not just about criticising the king and his evil counsellors. It's by making sure the political nation knows what's going on. And there's, in the debate, which people draw their swords, they get very cross, the remonstrance is passed in, I think it's the 22nd of November. It takes them 3 weeks, because it's a difficult decision. It's not usual to print for general consumption what's going on in Parliament. 15th of December 1641, they agree to print and circulate it. One of the people, a man called Sir Edward Deering, I think you look at Emerita on Kent, I think some of you. It's a Kentish gentleman, member of Parliament, has been sympathetic to reform. After this, he becomes an emerging royalist because he doesn't think you should remonstrate downwards. Telling the people the stories of Parliament's business. You should petition the king in a sort of private way. If you think he's doing wrong, you shouldn't tell stories to the people and talk of the king as a third person. And if we go back to Warwickshire, I said in 1642, Brooke has a lot of popular support. He has the support of the people, or some of the people. I don't think we're talking about majorities, we're talking about strategic minorities. But it's a lot of people. Brian Manning, who I think is another historian in your essay, in your article bank, he argued the royalists become the party of order. People who are worried about these appeals to the people, this rallying of the people, and so people who believe in hierarchy, obedience, the king at the head of that, then start to be more enthusiastic about the king. What's distinctive about England, of course, which Conrad Russell has often argued, poor man's dead, but argued for, is that there's a civil war in England because the king has significant support. There's no civil war in Scotland until 1644-5, because there aren't enough royalists to fight, for him. There's lots. Ireland is too complicated to think about, really. But there's a civil war because the king gets support. If you think what's different between 1640 and 42, the king has people who will fight for him. But what's really, I think, as significant is that Parliament has broken with notions of obedience and is able to raise enough people to fight against the Lord's anointed. And what I want to end with, I don't know how long I've gone on for. Okay, 5 minutes, yeah. It may not be completely relevant to your things about side taking. What's interesting to me now about the Civil War is that it becomes a revolution. Brooke is a radical parliamentarian who clearly wanted very significant religious change, and there are other people at the start. But the war starts, as you know, I think. Parliament said it was fighting for the king and Parliament. They're fighting to save the king for his evil counsellors. It ends, of course, outside the banqueting hall in Whitehall, executing the king after a trial for treason against his people. Treason had been disobeying the king. Now treason becomes the king disobeying his people. How does that happen? It's obviously a complicated story, but one thing I think is important is the way that Parliament, through things like printing the Grand Remonstrance, through inviting people to take oaths like the Protestation Oath, Parliament, or more properly, the House of Commons, the Grand Remonstrance is passed only by the Commons. It doesn't involve the House of Lords. The House of Commons claims to be the representative of the people, and it appeals to the people. Brooke's asking for volunteers in Warwickshire to fight the godly cause. People have been asked to take the Protestation Oath. They've petitioned in favour of the Grand Remonstrance, it having been circulated to them. And people like in Parliament's army by 1647 are thinking about what they fought for, because they've been invited to think what they've fought for. And this very powerful declaration, when they're actually disputing with Parliament what should happen next, we weren't a mercenary army. Brooke had refused to take mercenaries. We were called forth, conjured is this nice, conjuring up, by the several declarations of Parliament, engaged in a cause to defend the people's just rights and liberties. They're talking about rule of law, involvement in politics, not just simply doing as you're told. They're also many times also talking about religious liberty. And I think what's interesting about some of the processes of side taking involved reflection and engagement with a cause through propaganda, through participation in oath taking, in petitioning, and so on. That means that it had the potential to become much more radical than it began in 1642-3. Again, we're talking about minorities, but I think we're often talking about minorities, but significant ones. And I just wanted to end with a recent book that you might not have looked at. And there is a chapter, I don't know if you've got the Mike Braddock Companion to the English Revolution, English Civil War Revolution. It's now, I think John Walter has a good article in that. He's done a whole book about the protestation and how it was imposed, who took it, and so on. And what he wants to insist on, and I think it's hard in some of, is to think side taking is not simply about the elites rallying the troops to them. It's a process in which people outside elites could be very important. And that is because, as Walter argues, participation and political consciousness extended deep down into the social structure, experience of participation in governing, and also a sort of education in religion because of the complicated processes of religious change. And also networks of godly communities. If you're fighting the Lord's cause, then it's not this case that social rank was irrelevant. Social rank clearly was irrelevant, but sort of commitment to Puritan Reformation united Brooke with people who were otherwise his social inferiors. So I think the way that defence of true religion, and to some extent defence of the rule of law, could unite people around social classes. So I think I'll stop there.